Good morning, everybody. We have got a whole class of children that have something to say to you.
Hello!
And they are getting a sneak preview of part 2 of chapter 2 for our story packs before you guys even get to hear it. So you might hear some super good sound effects from us in a little while. So, Peter's anxiety began to stir. All day, the whole ride here, Peter had sensed it coiling. It always seemed like a snake to him, his anxiety, waiting just out of sight, ready to slither up his spine, hissing its familiar taunt. What might a snake sound like? You aren't where you should be. Keep going, that's quite good. Keep going. Something bad is going to happen, because you aren't where you should be. He rolled over and pulled out the cookie tin from under the bed. He fished out the photo of his father with one arm slung so casually around the black and white dog, as if he had never worried he could lose him. Inseparable. He hadn't missed the sense of pride that had entered his grandfather's voice as he'd said that. Of course he'd been proud. He'd raised a son who knew that his pet, who knew about loyalty and responsibility, who knew that a kid and his pet should be inseparable. Suddenly the word itself felt like an accusation. He and Pax, what were they then? Separable? They weren't though. Sometimes, in fact, Peter had the strange sensation that he and Pax actually merged. The first time it had happened had been the first time he'd taken Pax outdoors. The kid had seen a bird and had strained against the leash, trembling as though he'd been electrified. And Peter had seen the bird through Pax's eyes, the miraculous lightning flight, the impossible freedom and speed. He'd felt his own skin thrill in full body shivers and his own shoulders burn as though yearning for wings. It had happened again this afternoon. He had felt the car spin away as though he were the one being left. His heart had quickened with panic. Tears stung again and Peter palmed them with frustrated swipes. His father had said it was the right thing to do. War is coming. It means sacrifices for everybody. I have to serve. It's my duty, and you have to go away. Of course, he'd been half expecting it. Two of his friends' families had already packed up and left when the evacuation rumours had begun. What he hadn't expected was the rest, the worst part. And that fox, well, it's time to send him back into the wild anyway. Outrage. A coyote howled then. Now, what we know about coyotes is that they're an enemy of the fox. They're a dog-like animal from the dog family, but they're an enemy of the fox. So nearby that it made Peter jump. A second one answered, and then a third. Peter sat up and slammed the window shut, but it was too late. The yips and the howls and what they meant, they were in his head now. Peter had only 2 bad memories of his mother. He had a lot of good ones too, and he often took those out to comfort himself, although he worried that they might fade away from so much exposure. But the 2 bad ones he buried deep. He did everything in his power to keep them buried, and now the coyotes were baying in his head, unearthing one of them. Does anyone want to make a sort of dog-like noise, like a howl? When he'd been about 5, he'd come upon his mother standing dismayed beside a bed of blood-red tulips. Half of them were standing at attention, half of them splayed over the ground, their blossoms crumpling. A rabbit got them. He must think the stems are delicious, the little devil. Peter had helped his father set a trap that night. We won't hurt him, right? Fine, we'll just catch him and then drive him into the next town. Let him eat someone else's tulips. Peter had baited the trap himself with a carrot and then begged his father to let him sleep in the garden to keep watch. His father had said no, but helped him set an alarm clock so he'd be the first to awaken. When it went off, Peter had run to his mother's room to lead her outside by the hand to see the surprise. The trap lay on its side at the bottom of a freshly scraped crater at least 5 feet across. Inside was a little baby rabbit, dead. There wasn't a single mark on its body, but the cage was scratched and dented, and the ground all around clawed to rubble. Coyotes, his father said, joining them. They must have scared it to death trying to get in, and none of us even woke up. So that noise is bringing back that bad memory for him. Peter's mother had opened the trap and lifted out the lifeless form. She held it to her cheek. They were only tulips, just a few tulips. Peter found the carrot, one end nibbled off, and threw it as far away as he could. Then his mother had placed the rabbit's body in his cupped palms and gone to get a shovel. With a single finger, Peter had traced its ears, unfurling like ferns from its face, and its paws miraculously tiny, and the soft fur of its neck slick with his mother's tears. When she returned, his mother touched his face, which burned with shame. "It's okay, you didn't know." But it wasn't okay, and for a long time afterward, when Peter closed his eyes, he'd seen coyotes, their claws raking dirt and their jaws snapping. He saw himself where he should have been, keeping watch in the garden that night. Over and over and over and over, he saw himself doing what he should have, rising from his sleeping bag, finding a rock and hurling it. He saw the coyotes fleeing back into the darkness, and he saw himself opening the trap to set the rabbit free. And with that memory, the anxiety snake struck so hard that it stunned Peter's breath out of him. He hadn't been where he should have been the night the coyotes killed the rabbit, and he wasn't where he should be now. He gasped to fill his lungs and sat bolt upright. He tore the photo in half and then in half again and pitched the pieces under the bed. Leaving Pax had not been the right thing to do. He jumped to his feet. He'd already lost a lot of time. He fished some cargoes, a long-sleeve camouflage t-shirt and a fleece sweatshirt from his suitcase, and then an extra set of underwear and socks. He stuffed everything inside the rucksack except the sweatshirt, which he tied around his waist. Jackknife in his jeans pocket, wallet. He debated for a minute between his hiking boots and his trainers and decided on the boots, although he didn't put them on. He looked around the room, hoping to find a torch or anything resembling camping equipment. The room had been his father's when he'd been a boy, but aside from a few books on a shelf, it was clear his grandfather had cleaned all his things out. The cookie tin had seemed to surprise him, an oversight. Peter bumped his fingers over the spine of books. An atlas. What do you think he's doing?
Trying to go find.
He might be packing his things to go and try and find Pax. Why do you think he's picked an atlas?
To mark where he's going.
To figure out where he's going? Yeah, because we know that's full of maps. Do you think that's going to be useful for him?
Yes.
Do we?
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
So, his father had tried to bridge the silence of the drive a couple of times. "If I get a day off, I'll come and I'll see you." Peter had known that it would never happen. They didn't give days off in war. Besides, it wasn't his father he was already missing. And then he saw something he hadn't realised. The highway snaked around a long range of foothills. If he cut straight across those instead of following the highway, he could save so much time, and then he'd reduce the risk of being caught. He started to rip out the page and then realised that he couldn't leave his grandfather such an obvious clue. Instead, he studied the map for a long moment and then replaced the atlas on the shelf. 300 miles. It looked like he could shave off 100 of them by taking the shortcut, so say around 200. If he could walk at least 30 miles a day, he could make it in a week or less. They'd left Pax at the head of the access road that led to the ruins of an old rope mill. Peter had insisted on this road because hardly anyone used it. Pax didn't know about traffic, and because there were woods and fields all around, he'd go back, find Pax there, waiting in 7 days. He wouldn't let himself think about what might happen to a tame fox in 7 days. No, Pax would be waiting by the side of the road, right where they'd left him. He'd be okay. Peter would then take him home, and they would stay there, and just let someone try and make him leave this time. That was the right thing to do. He and Pax, inseparable. He glanced around the room again, resisting the urge to just run. He couldn't afford to miss anything. The bed. He pulled the blanket off, rumpled the sheets and punched the pillow until it looked slept on. From his suitcase he took out the picture of his mother he'd kept on his bureau. The one taken on her last birthday, holding up the kite Peter had made for her and smiling as if she'd never seen a better present in her life, and he slid it into his backpack. Next, he pulled out things of hers he'd kept hidden in his bottom drawer at home. Her gardening gloves, still smudged with the last soil she'd ever lifted. A box of her favourite tea, which had long ago lost its peppermint scent. The thick candy cane striped knee socks that she wore in the winter. He touched them all, wishing he could take back home everything where it belonged, and then chose the smallest of the items. A gold bracelet with an enamelled phoenix charm she'd worn every day and tucked it into the middle of his rucksack with the photo. Peter surveyed the room one last time, so he looked around and he eyed his baseball and glove and crossed to the bureau and stuffed them in the rucksack too. They didn't weigh much, and he'd want them when he was back at home. Besides, he just felt better when he had them. And then he eased the door open and crept to the kitchen. He set the rucksack on the oak table, and in the dim light from above the stove, he began to pack supplies: a box of raisins, a sleeve of crackers, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter, because Pax would come out of any hiding spot for peanut butter. From the refrigerator, he took a bunch of string cheese sticks and 2 oranges. He filled the thermos with water and then hunted through drawers until he found matches, which he wrapped in tinfoil. Under the sink, he scored 2 lucky finds: a roll of duct tape, a box of heavy-duty garbage bags, and a tarp. A tarp would have been better, but he took the 2 bags of gratitude and zipped the pack. Finally, he took a sheet of paper from the pad beside the phone and began a note. "Dear Grandfather." Peter looked at the words for a minute as if they were a foreign language, and then crumpled the paper up and started a new note. "I left early, wanted to get a good start for school. See you tonight." He stared at the page for a while too, wondering if it sounded as guilty as he felt. At last, he added, "Thanks for everything, Peter," placed the note under the salt shaker and slipped out. On the brick walk, he shrugged his sweatshirt and crouched to lace his boots. He straightened up and shouldered his rucksack. Then he took a moment to look around. The house behind him already seemed so much smaller than it had when he'd arrived, as if it were already receding into the past. Across the street, clouds scudded along the horizon, and a half moon suddenly emerged, brightening the road ahead. Who's happy that he's going to try and find Pax? We've all got our hands up, by the way. Who's a little bit worried that it might not go to plan? The next chapter, I'm going to give you all a preview now of the beginning of chapter 3. Pax was hungry and cold, but what had woken him was the sense that he needed cover. And you'll find out next time. See you later. Say goodbye.
Bye.